Thank you again to all who have helped lead us in worship and to all who have been participating as well. It is a glorious thing to worship together as a community of faith. This morning, as we think about Epiphany, I want to read two passages of Scripture as we begin. The first is from Psalm 72. I'll read verses 1 through 7 and then 11 through 14. Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to a king's son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. May the mountains yield prosperity for the people and the hills in righteousness. May he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the needy and crush the oppressor. May he live while the sun endures, and as long as the moon throughout all generations. May he be like rain that falls on mown grass, like showers that water the earth. In his days may righteousness flourish and peace abound until the moon is no more. Verse 11, may all kings fall down before him, all nations give him service, for he delivers the needy when they call, the poor and those who have no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy of the needy. From oppression and violence he redeems their life, and precious is their blood in his sight. And now to the New Testament. We'll be reading Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is this child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star in the east and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where this Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. From you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the Magi and learned from them the exact time the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word so that I may go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen in the east, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. They knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. This is the word of the Lord for the people of God. Thanks be to God. This summer, I went to a conference in Raleigh, North Carolina, and it was a conference that I'd never been to, and I had never met any of the people in the conference before, other than maybe an interaction online. The first thing to do at that conference was to go to some workshops, and so I went to a workshop that seemed interesting. There were not enough chairs. We were crammed together, and we were talking to one another as we waited for the workshop to start. Eventually, it became an interactive workshop. There was lots of conversation, and I was sitting next to a woman. She introduced herself to me as Karen. We got to know each other, talked about life, things like that, small talk, talked about church. She was so kind and pleasant and interesting, and I thought, well, what a nice person and a friend to make on this first day in a new place with new people. A few days later, during the conference, she stood up to speak, and I realized that she was a renowned New Testament scholar. In fact, I had bought her book 2 weeks before, but I hadn't got around to reading it yet. I had no idea that Karen was that Karen. A few months later, I got around to reading her book. It's wonderful. Her arguments are fantastic. Her work with the text is expert. But I was also moved by the book because of her character, because of the kind of person that she is and was even by her own humility, that she didn't lead with, oh yeah, I'm so-and-so. Just Karen, a neighbor in a workshop. This Sunday is the Sunday we celebrate Epiphany in the Christian calendar. Epiphany means to be revealed, to be unveiled. It happens here at the end of our Christmas season, and it's the day where we recognize the Magi coming to see Christ. We call it Epiphany because Christ is revealed to them, and that for us is a symbol of how Christ has come, not just for the people in Bethlehem or Jerusalem or Judea, but for the whole world. These Magi came from distant places to see this King and worship Christ, foreshadowing for us what will be unveiled throughout the pages of the New Testament, how Christ has come. Christ is the Messiah, Christ is King, and not just one group of people's King, but Christ has been revealed for all people. And we celebrate this King, and we know this King, Jesus, revealed both by his actions and with his character. So today I want to talk about kings. I want to talk about Herod, about these Magi. I want to talk about Jesus. The two passages we read today, Psalm 72 and Matthew chapter 2, both tell us something about kings, don't they? They both have a vision of a king. In the first, we find this psalm that is a prayer imagining the ideal king. It is a prayer for a king when a king takes rule. What they are asking God will do with this king. You see, within Psalm 72, all of these things the psalmist is asking God to do, like give the king your justice, judge your people with righteousness, care for the poor with justice, defend the cause of those in need. We see in Psalm 72 a prayer inviting God to share God's very character with this ruler. In Matthew 2, we meet a different kind of king. We meet Herod. Herod, a king serving underneath the rule of Rome, doesn't seem anything like the king in Psalm 72. This is an insecure king who tries to manipulate others, protect himself, eliminate threats. A human ruler that has taken all the power and let it go to his head. And his attempts to stay in power drives his every move. We see this tension between what this hope for a king might be and what the reality of King Herod was. And at the same time, we see this glimpse of a new king, a child, Jesus, the king that fulfills what Psalm 72 can only dream about. We see in Psalm 72 all kinds of insight into what we might pray for when we pray for our leaders, what we might hope for leaders in general. Conrad Schaefer, a scholar, observes the ruler's first responsibility is to ensure law and order and defend the rights of all levels of society, particularly the helpless and the poor. This is as much part of the natural order as the mountains, the hills, the sun, the moon, the climate. The vision for this prayer and leadership that is desired for a king is marked by God's vision for God's creation. A king we see in the first 4 verses that will lead with righteous justice, who defends the afflicted, cares for those in need. We see in verses 5 through 7 a king who is interested in the universal flourishing of all. That this king will bring goodness that will fall like rain everywhere. I love in verse 2 it says the mountains will yield prosperity for your people. I don't know if you're a farmer, but I doubt you've farmed much on a mountain. That's not the place where usually there is prosperity. It's a vision of flourishing, happening all over. This image in verse 11, that all kings would fall down before him, that this king would have a global and enduring kingdom. And again, we see this deep sense of compassion. Verses 12 through 14, he delivers the needy when they call, the poor and those who have no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy and saves the lives of the needy from oppression and violence. He redeems their life, and precious is their blood in his sight. We long for leaders like this, don't we? One who would lead in a way that cares deeply about those who have no other advocates. We long to lead like that ourselves. Wouldn't it be good to find leaders who care more about the hurting than prophets or power or posturing? Psalm 72 is a prayer asking God to develop and create an ideal king, a king that might live up to God's very character. And so I want to encourage you to pray for your leaders in your life and give you this psalm as a guide to pray for them. And there may be leaders in your world that you don't want to pray for. This is a good psalm to pray regardless. Prayer, of course, will go hand in hand with more than words. It can go hand in hand with your actions. So don't just pray. Yes, call representatives and advocate and do the work and vote and let these characteristics emerge from you. Pray that God would give you these characteristics too, but pray, Psalm 72, for your leaders. But as you read the psalm, you may think, I've never seen a king like this. I've never seen a leader like this. Even my most favorites, the ones whose buttons I wore, they didn't quite look like this. No one lived up to it. This psalm may have been written for Solomon, perhaps written in support of David. We're not exactly sure, but no king lives up to it. Solomon was wise, but he fell. David had all kinds of problems. The kings after those two would be mostly a mess in Israel. Later prophets, when reflecting on this psalm, would use this particular psalm often to illustrate just how much their kings had been a disappointment. As commentator James Mays says, the chasm between calling and capacity yawns under the feet of every king for whom this prayer was made. The prayer calls for divine government to inhabit human rulers. That is, God's character to inhabit human rulers. This model for kingship is far more than a challenge and a goal. It is a prescription for failure. For the later prophets, this Psalm 72 lampoons their leaders. And that's a message we perhaps need to hear today when we can be tempted to put our trust or hope or expectations in leaders, politicians. Psalm 72 helps us see how much human leaders tend more towards Herod than hero. They have since we've ever had leaders. Is that all Psalm 72 is? Just this hopeful exercise that exposes all the flaws of every leader that ever was? Well, not quite. Psalm 72, when paired with the story in Matthew, what we've read here on Epiphany Sunday, tells us something about Jesus. It shows us something about Jesus' very character, about when God answered all of these prayers by taking on all of this character and vision himself. The story in Matthew tells us about what we often call the three kings. They're probably not kings, they're more likely scholars, astrologists, philosophers. We say three because they had three gifts. We don't know how many there were, though in most imaginings we have 3, and 3 is a pretty good number to include in your story and include in your visualization or include in your nativity outside the front of your church. We can't be sure exactly what this was like. The story is pretty sparse in detail, but it captures our imagination. And I love how preacher and theologian Barbara Brown Taylor retells this story, and so I want to share how she does. She tells it like this. Once upon a time, there were 3 very wise men who were all sitting in their own countries, minding their own business, when a bright star lodged in the right eye of each one of them. It was so bright that none of them could tell where it was burning in the sky. None of them could tell if it was just in the sky or in their imaginations, but they were so wise that they knew that it didn't really matter much. The point was something beyond them was calling them. It was a tug that they had been waiting for all their lives. Each in his own country had tried books and tried magic and tried astrology and reflexology. One had spent his entire fortune learning how to read and write ancient languages. Another lived on nothing but dried herbs and boiled water. A third could walk on hot coals, but it did nothing for him, besides the sense of great relief that he felt at the end of that. They were all glad for a reason to get out of town, because that was clearly where the star was calling them to get out, away from everything they knew, how to manage, how to survive, out from under their reputations that they had built for themselves, their high expectations and disappointing returns, and so they set out. One by one, each believing that he was the only one with a star in his eye, until they all ran into one another on the road to Jerusalem. From a distance, each had thought the other was a mirage at first, a twinkling reflection made out of vapor and heat, but as they drew near one another, they saw the star they had in common, and it was like a tattoo or a secret handshake. It made them brothers before they had even spoke. Matthew tells us that they go to Jerusalem because that's where the capital is, so where else would you find a king? They've been studying scriptures and trying to figure out what this could mean. It must be a new king. So they get to Jerusalem and they find a king. Perhaps they had even read Psalm 72 before, and they find Herod. And I wonder if they said, "Do you have any more kings in the back? Can you check?" Herod is there, and he's frightened, it says, of this idea there might be another king, that one would threaten him or challenge him. And notice when he asks his experts about this, he doesn't just ask like, "Oh, is there some usurper out there?" He asks about the Messiah. This is God's king. Herod wants to stand in the way of how God would bless all people. Herod could not be more different than Psalm 72. He perverts justice, seeks only his own flourishing, wants a narrow and controllable kingdom. He has no care for his people. And so, he turns on the charm, tells the Magi they should go and figure this out. Go to Bethlehem and see, and let me know what you find out. The text tells us that they go. They follow the star and they find something they clearly could not have expected. In a simple place, the poor family, a child. Barbara Brown Taylor imagines how that part went like this. If they had chosen this place themselves, this door, this house, they might never have knocked. But the star had chosen, so they did. And when the door opened, the couple inside almost died of fright. Not that the wise men noticed. With their arms full of gifts, they crowded into the small space, bumping their hats on the rafters and snagging their robes on the rough furniture. All they could see was the baby, who was not afraid, whose right eye shone with the same star they had seen before they left home. It was he, then, whoever he was. They didn't have a clue, but they knew what to do. They got on their knees and they worshiped him. They gave him the things they had brought, all the wrong things. They could see now these things had no use for him. They should have brought milk or a blanket or something shiny to hang above his crib. But how could they have guessed? The child's parents were gracious. They thanked the foreigners for their gifts. They held them up for the baby to see. And then the wise men, to their alarm, the child's mother picked him up and handed him around so that each one of them held that damp, soft, living weight in his arms. And she took him back and nursed him, and then they fell asleep where they sat. And in the morning, the wise men could not find their stars anywhere. They looked in all the corners and under the chairs. The baby's mother even shook out the blankets. But after the initial panic, the wise men said, never mind. They didn't need the star anymore. They found what they were looking for, and they could not lose it. As much as they hated to, they guessed they'd better be on their way. But they were not going back through Jerusalem. They said all three of them had had a dream that said, steer clear of there, as if they needed to be told. If anyone in Jerusalem knew anything at all, they would be here instead of there. Besides, none of their old maps worked anymore. They had to find a new way home. So the wise men picked up their packs, now lighter than before. They lined up in front of the baby to thank him for the gifts he had given. What are you talking about? The baby's mother laughed. And they told her that so that she could tell him later. For this home and the love here, said the first wise man, who could not remember how to say it in that ancient language he had studied. For the baby's flesh, said the second wise man, who had no interest in living on herbs anymore. For a really great story, said the third wise man, who thought telling it might do a lot more good for him than walking on coals. And then the three wise men trooped outside, stretched, kissed the baby goodbye, and went home by another way. The Magi came to find a king. And likely, even with their wildest dreaming, even what they had read in texts like the Psalms, they couldn't imagine a king could live up to, well, what we see in the Psalms. But then they see Jesus. They pay homage. They go home changed forever. Now, when we know the story of Jesus, when we read Psalm 72, this vision of healing and saving and bringing justice and care, seeing God's community expanded to all people, seeing a kingdom that is abundant, where the powers of our world have no real power, where death is defeated, where purpose and meaning is available for all, we all see how Psalm 72 points us to a king that only could be realized if God chose to act and God chose to be with us. That all of us see this story, see Jesus with stars in our eyes, and see that a star might lead us to this one true king, one worth following. That this psalm will challenge us. That Psalm 72 will not just be a text to make us disappointed in our earthly leaders, but will spark an epiphany in our own minds. That this child, this carpenter, this man who is somehow also God, really is the king. Really is worth following, whatever it takes, whatever it costs. He's worth sharing our treasures, taking new roads, riling up the powers that be. Theologian Stanley Hauerwas reminds us, we would like a church that again asserts that God, not nations, not rulers of the world, that the boundaries of God's kingdom transcend those of Caesar, and that the main political task of the church is the formation of people who see clearly the cost of discipleship and are willing to pay the price, willing to risk upsetting Herod, our safety, our comfort, willing to risk that things we're used to, willing to go home a different way, transformed and changed. Epiphany celebrates the revealing of Christ to the nations. Just as the Magi sought the true King, we too are invited to seek Christ, bow before him, embrace his vision, and participate in his reign of righteous justice and universal flourishing, of global and enduring kingdom that is for all people of compassionate care. Where is the one that we are seeking leading us? How might we leave changed? How might you need to go home a different way? How might you be characterized as you follow this Jesus? As we turn to the communion table today, I want us to imagine a banquet one day where these wise people will be at the table with us. Stars in all of our eyes. And we'll see this table and the community that God has called us to be. One people surrounding the bread and the wine, celebrating God who has brought us together. A God who has come, a God who is King, a God who conquers not only small, insignificant, corrupt kings like Herod, but all the powers that hold us back. A God who conquers death, not by bluster, but by a body broken, by blood poured out, a tomb that is empty. I'll invite the deacons to come forward as we take communion today and we remember our King, that we may remember that He has a gift for us. I don't know what you've brought today, but He has a gift for you. His body, His blood poured out for you to welcome you to the family. All of us are invited to be redeemed, to be rescued, to follow our good King.
Hey, I'm Evan Duncan, the senior pastor of the Baptist Church of Westchester, and I'm so glad you found us on YouTube. I just want to thank you for engaging with us. If there is more you want to know about our church, about ways to connect, or even if you want to support the work of God in our community, you can visit bcwc.org. That's also how you can connect with us. As you go, I want to share with you a blessing, a benediction that comes out of this book, A Common Prayer, a Liturgy for Ordinary Radicals. May the peace of the Lord Jesus Christ go with you wherever He may send you. May He guide you in the wilderness, protect you through the storms. May He bring you home rejoicing at the wonders He has shown you. May He bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Go in peace and be the church.